Thanks so much for the warm welcome, Nat. And I am so excited to be here today talking about what can make persuasive and effective messaging. So, we're going to be chatting all about what that means. So, my name is Catherine LeBlanc. I grew up in Dartmouth, right across the harbor, same municipality. My parents are even here today. Woo! My dad says that the only question I'm allowed to ask him is what's for supper. No quizzes on CLTs. So I grew up here in Nova Scotia, lived in Ottawa for a while, and started working with the Ottawa Community Land Trust, which is such a great team. Patrick's here today, and some other folks like Mike are here as well. I lived in Ottawa for about a decade, moved to Winnipeg, and started working with the West Broadway Community Land Trust that has some folks here as well, in addition to other housing organizations. I run a communications agency that works with social impact, nonprofit, philanthropy, social finance, labor, like good causes only. And yeah, that's a little bit about me. So I'm thrilled to be here today giving a presentation that I give pretty often, but with a CLT spin. So as I just mentioned, having grown up in Nova Scotia, the land, the ocean, everything that is nature and land around us is something that we really cherish as Nova Scotians. So just wanted to give a acknowledgement of the land that we're here in Mi'kma'ki. When it comes to this presentation today, we're going to be discussing two things. So firstly, we're going to be talking about why having good messaging, good, strong, effective, persuasive messaging matters, and sort of the best practices and theory behind this. So knowing what is messaging, what makes good messaging, where does this research come from, and how you can use this. Then the second half of this presentation is going to be on, I would say, the practical step-by-step information on how to leverage this as your organization by creating message guides, by creating tone of voice guidelines, that sort of thing. So, why does messaging matter? Strong messaging can help you build support for your cause. Whether you are with a grassroots CLT trying to be scrappy with every single dollar, as I'm sure many of you are, or whether you're a larger, more established entity, you need to be persuasive to win people over to your cause. Whether it is to secure support in a, say, fundraising or bonds campaign, or whether it is to win over members of the community to organize with your cause, or to maybe try to girl boss your government around, right? Like into some funding for an acquisition fund. No matter what you're working on within this movement, you're trying to be effective advocates for your cause. And there's actually a lot of research and even cognitive behavioral psychology that informs how to be persuasive. So instead of y'all having to read lots of papers, I've done that and am summarizing this into a presentation for you today. Strong messaging builds grassroots power and invites action. Well, that was just my first answer, but I'd love to hear from you folks on why you think being persuasive and having effective messaging would help your organization. So if you were really persuasive, why would that be really great? What would it help you with? Yes. Money. Yeah. Yes, convincing people to give you money, regardless of what you're using, regardless if it's government, the sort of grassroots action, community partners. Y'all already know how CLTs can get money, but this session helps you be persuasive to be more effective doing that. I saw a hand up in the back. Yep. Yeah. Yep. The answer was like time management. So if when you speak or write about your land trust, you'd either be effective and persuasive and people can understand you and you be clear, or maybe your messaging is confusing and no one understands what you're talking about. So what I took from that answer of time management is you're wasting your time if you're saying things that don't make sense, or if you're saying things that are too technical, or saying things that maybe despite your best intentions don't leverage best practices in persuasion. I'd love some other answers. Yep. Yeah. So that answer was helping to move people to closer to the perspective of your CLT. So there is the team running your CLT, and then there's your audiences. Maybe they sometimes feel further apart, right? Whether you're talking to people who have a more market-centered view of housing, maybe the government or whoever you're talking to may not be on your side yet. How do you narrow that gap? How do you build alignment within your audiences so that they get what you're saying and they value it? Yes. Yes, yeah, that's a great answer. So the answer was to debunk misconceptions about the model. And I would add on that, and I would also say it's really just to get people to think what you want them to think, which sort of aligns with that answer of the POV. So, to make them understand the model, to value the model, and to know why you. There's a lot of groups doing housing things, and there's different models, and also there's other causes too, as well, when we're in a what do they call it? A poly crisis. So climate, food security, those are all very important, but there's a busy landscape to stand out in. A couple other answers that come to mind is if you could be in a PR crisis, someone could be in trouble, right? So you want to have good messaging so that risk of a crisis doesn't spiral further. Or also sometimes ineffective communications can further governance challenges. It can Ineffective communications and messaging can further divides also in the relationship with community, or it can strengthen it and cement it and really convey, for example, that your CLT is very community based and grassroots based. So those are a few answers, although I'll just remind us of the first one, which was money. So that was pretty important, but these all were. So effective messaging helps shape public policy. So maybe you're trying to advocate for an acquisitions fund in your jurisdiction, or otherwise make a public policy environment that is more advantageous to CLTs and to community housing overall. So influences policy. It also can mobilize community and mobilize your land trust and partners. And for community land trusts, messaging can really support advocacy, brand building, resource mobilization, movement building, education, and so much more. That's the why behind why we are here today, why we're talking about why this matters. So firstly, I wanted to talk about understanding framing. So when I talk about messaging, like what actually is messaging and how are we approaching it today? So the message is like what you're saying, right? So a message or messaging can be how you're talking about your CLT or how you're writing down information about your CLT. And the idea is that codifying and having some consistency in your messaging and refining it and making it strong and clear will help you get a lot further towards all those nice outcomes we were talking about earlier, like advocacy and money. And then messaging is not always the same. Messaging can have different approaches to what we call framing. So what is framing? Framing is using language to set the terms of how we want our audience to understand our issue. So framing can alter people's perception of a problem and motivate them to support it, or it could make them not motivated to support it, right? Good messaging and effective framing can build empathy and win people over to your cause, which is so important in this sort of CLT community housing space, or it can divide people. So, and us at the CLT conference and doing nice progressive work, we're not the only people who are thinking about framing. Who else uses framing? The far right. And just people against your work and people against other movements for justice and human rights. In fact, people who are advocating against these things are often masters at framing, right? So we gotta really seize this as well. So we can all think of times where really dramatic messaging from a sensationalist politician or public figure has helped galvanize people against human rights and housing and anti-poverty measures and things like that, right? It's pitted people against each other to divide them to distract them from the real issues. So just to give some examples, so of some word choices, some decisions that give an example of what framing means. So just think about when it comes to discourse and media discourse on, for example, undocumented folks versus like a very bad term would be if the term was like illegal alien. So that's an example of a choice that is a tremendous difference in framing. And if you were to go put your uncle or your random friend in front of Fox News and they were to hear some really bad messaging and framing, Fox News can suck people in, or maybe it's not Fox News, maybe it's your local community station that's taking a NIMBY approach to housing, right? Another example would be whether you're naming the issue in your messaging or whether you're obfuscating it, right? So whether you're calling it out or making it a little bit harder to notice. So an example would be if you're saying Indigenous communities are impacted by resource development, or if you said something like oil and gas companies are building pipelines on Indigenous lands. So what I'm going to be sharing today is informed by research and a body of work from different communications experts. But someone I'm particularly going to be citing today is named Anat Shanker-Osorio. And I will be giving the links and the slides after this, so don't worry about remembering that person's name. And it comes from an evidence-based, research-based approach to studying persuasion. So what I'm saying is also influenced by projects that I've done, my understanding, my experience in working on projects, and some polling projects that I've been on, but it also comes from a immense body of work that's been backed up through polling and focus groups, testing things like what works better, this or that, in messaging and persuasion. Or what about this other thing or that other thing? And that has informed what we're going to be talking about today. I'm pulling from a few other frameworks as well. You'll get the links to everything. So an example of something that we'll talk a lot today is informed by the race, class, gender narrative. And what that is a science and cognitive psychology and communications research backed approach to persuasion. And it came out of, in the States, a need to communicate to people about causes that are often social in nature when they may not belong to the community that they're hearing about. So how do you get white people to care about race? How do you get people who are not Indigenous to care about Indigenous rights? How do you get people who are not trans to care about trans rights? How do you get people who own their home and are pretty comfortable to care about social housing? It's not on only one issue, it's really on anything. So that happens to be the title of the framing. It's very helpful for human rights arguments. It's also very helpful to housing and has been extensively worked on that as well. So firstly, I want to talk about some notes on what works in messaging. What are these best practices? So firstly and foremost, you need to be concise. Don't use a $2 word when a smaller word would do. Be as short and concise as possible. And being conversational and using relatable words when you can is better than overusing technical language. I know that some of you here are wondering about, well, I work in social finance and CLTs, and how do I balance technical info with non-technical info? We're going to talk about that later. Additionally, using repetition to reinforce your messaging is one of the most important things, and it's more important than people realize. They think, oh, we posted about this thing. You know, we've said it a few times. I don't want to feel like I'm repeating myself. Think about Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders has been saying the same few things for forever, right? It's not like Bernie Sanders comes up with a different frame or different analysis every time he talks. He's not pulling out different messaging. He's been saying the same things for decades. If he tried to start saying something totally different, we wouldn't remember him in such a clear, memorable way. And when it comes to organizations, you're going to be codifying your messaging and you're going to be repeating it more than you think that you need to. time at which your staff or your volunteers, your team start to get a little bit sick of repeating yourself is actually when you've only started to scrape the surface of how much you need to repeat yourself. And when I say repetition, I don't mean posting the same thing every day, right? So say you have a really important message that's a rallying cry for your cause. Well, your cause is important. And talking about your cause is important enough to say it more than once. So let's pull an Instagram example. Maybe one day you post it with that saying on the graphic itself. And then maybe a week later, you're posting a picture and then that message is in the caption, right? And then maybe a few weeks later, it's in a video or it's on Instagram stories, or maybe you're jumping to another channel, it's on your newsletter. That's what I mean by it's not like you're posting the same thing every day. You can weave messaging into your content in different ways. Again, to bridge to say, for example, a newsletter example. So maybe one day you're just writing it as normal, and then the next time maybe it's a letter from your board chair, right? So that's a different way of you can be talking about the same thing. You can be using the same rallying cry phrases, but just weaving it in a different way. So it's repetition, not sounding like a robot, because you can still be creative. Thirdly, I want to mention something that should be pretty common to think about from folks in this room, and it's when we are working with and communicating about and in service of communities who are lower income, communities who are facing difficulty in finding affordable housing, or in any other, communicating with any other marginalized communities, we need to use a strengths-based frame and not a deficit-based frame. So communications research shows that when you use a deficit-based frame, which is saying like such and such community, they have this problem and this problem and this problem and this problem, and that's why we need to help them. That's a deficit-based frame. Whereas a strengths-based frame involves talking about the strengths and the incredible, amazing things that this community has going on, and balancing that with also mentioning the problem. You can use a strengths-based frame and still make it clear that you're advocating to fix a problem. It's the difference between is every single thing you say a problem versus is it a bit more of a balance. Just ask yourself if you're highlighting a community's strengths as well, right? So emphasize what the community brings and not just totally what they lack. So research of audiences has shown that when they see deficit-based framing, there's two problems with this. Number one, it literally doesn't even win them over to the issue. So it's not like talking about the problem in a deficit-based frame. It'll win them over to solving the fight and they support you. No, it actually makes them tune out because we're in a 24/7 news cycle where we hear about problems all of the time. So if your, context is problem, 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 you're not even motivating people to help you. Secondly, the other reason why we don't use deficit-based framing is it massively reinforces biases. So if people are hearing about a community's problem, whether it's a certain neighborhood in your city that your land trust serves, or whether it's a, for example, marginalized community, it's very important to do this so you're not reinforcing biases. And lastly, another thing on this slide in terms of what works with messaging is rooting it in universal shared human values. And I'm going to be talking about how to do that, what that means, and we're going to be going over that, but that's a highlight. And last on this what works in messaging list is to always center your own narrative. So if one day you're giving a speech or you're posting on social media and it's your CLT talking about yourself, it's probably pretty clear that you need to center your own messaging, your own work, your own narrative. But in many cases, it becomes less clear. So what if there was a big debate in your community on whether or not a certain social housing complex should go in? What if there was a certain debate at your city council on like whether it makes sense to fund safe injection sites or any other number of social related programs that and housing that could be controversial but are ultimately good. Or to bring something from, as an example, from the human rights space that I work on a lot, like what if someone goes out and says something horrendous, like says something bad about trans communities or says something bad about Indigenous communities? These are contexts where you're set up for a debate. And it's a common mistake when you're in a debate. So say you're invited to speak on CBC in response to something that's going on, right? Sometimes people approach this like a high school debate exercise where, and with very good intentions, they will fall into this trap, but unfortunately, we know it's not persuasive. What I mean is say if someone said something bad, right? And they said 10 things, 10 falsehoods or 10 things that were from a problematic frame. If you were to then go on the radio and say, let me respond to these 10 things. He said this, and here's why it's wrong. And he said this, and here's why it's wrong. And he said this, but I said that. And he said this, and I said that. You may think that you are doing the right thing because you're refuting something bad. But unfortunately, research from audiences shows that when you repeat the bad thing just to argue against it and refute it, you accidentally cement the bad thing in your audience's minds. So for example, if you're saying things like, the mayor said that social housing is bad, but social housing isn't bad, people will just remember social housing and bad. They won't remember if you're for or against. Again, to give that radio example, people are driving home, they're picking up their kids, they're parking, turning off the radio, and tuning out halfway through your interview. Or maybe it's in an article in the Toronto Star or something on your social media. So that's an example of being in a debate and not centering your own narrative and accidentally amplifying the bad stuff. So what do you do instead? You prep your own key messaging and you run with it and center it far more. I would ask you in that case to say if you were on a radio responding for something, make a narrative sandwich. So start with your prepped messaging, and then the meat of the sandwich could be that fact check or that pushback a little bit more directly to the bad guy. And then the closing bread of the sandwich is closing back with your argumentation, rather than a 10-point high school debate refutation exercise. This is not always going to be the case. You're not always going to be in such an oppositional narrative environment. But when you are, just make sure to remember that it's a very common mistake. Next up, what are some common CLT and housing messaging pitfalls? So you all know already that many people do not know what a community land trust is. So just accept that you're always going to be explaining and re-explaining this. It's part of your mission, right, to be transparent and clear on what you do and to bring the community into it. So just accept the fact that you've chosen to work in a movement that's a little bit less clear than something, say, everyone knows what a teacher in an elementary school is, and everyone knows what a food bank are. But there are so many parts of our social good work that take a little bit more explaining, and the CLTs certainly fall in that, right? Additionally, avoid only using technical details. And so that can be a common CLT pitfall. I'm going to explain later on how. So sometimes you can just use plain English and just use social good values about the importance of housing and respect for people. But sometimes you will need to communicate technical information. And when you do that, I'm going to be going over a mix of how to do that, about how to still center impact and values when you have to communicate something technical. And also don't use passive or abstract language. So to think of high school English class saying something in the passive voice of like describing what someone did in a more abstract way rather than saying it explicitly. Here's my slide on how to convey technical information clearly. Option 1, say it only in a simple English, clear, plain way without technical language. There will be some cases where you're just saying about like why like social housing is good, why you may be able to just exclusively summarize it in an accessible way. Sometimes you may need to use more technical language. Excuse me as I pause to sip of water. What I recommend is to start with the emotional hook. Center it, start with plain language, start with emotion and shared values, and then follow up with the technical. I literally recommend this even when you are talking to experts and policymakers, because experts are people too. Funders are people too. Politicians and bureaucrats are people too. And some people get technical briefings all day long. You may still have some technical information to share, but ground it in the why, because everyone is asking for money all the time, and this is how you break through. All right, so now we're going to go over a 4-part messaging model. Um, uh, and here it is. So I like to use this in a way where I suggest writing messaging in bullet points. No one is as clear and concise when they write in paragraphs with a first draft. Honestly, writing in bullets forces you to be more clear and concise, because a bullet looks really silly if it takes up a whole page, right? So just a reminder. So these are 4 bullets in a certain order. And it has to do with how we process information, what makes people care and listen versus continue to scroll or change the channel, literally on TV. Number 1, lead with an emotional connection grounded in shared values. So what does shared values mean? So think about what human beings all want and need as a baseline. Don't think about what everybody at the just West Broadway Community Land Trust seems to think, because that would be speaking into a bubble of people who only think like you and that are only organizing on your cause, right? Instead, think about what someone who doesn't share your political ideology, someone who may not know much about your issue, what do they think and want for themselves and their family? They want love, respect, care, safety, shelter, a good future for themselves and their family. That's the level to which we're bringing shared values down. So those are just some examples, and I can encourage you to brainstorm different ones that come to your issue. So doing this, leading with an emotional connection grounded in shared universal human values, it helps to speak across differences and not speak into a bubble that only the most hardcore advocates care about. And a particular approach to this that comes from the race, class, gender narrative, that was the evidence and research-backed approach to persuasion, would be to be saying something. And I'm just thinking about some land trusts are neighborhood-based, some are also further representing certain communities. An example would be about saying something like, no matter who we are or where we grew up, that would be an example of no matter what our background is. Those would be some examples of using that type of framing before saying something like, no matter what our background is, we all want the best for our family. So those are some examples of how we start to make people not only care about, I'm a suburban dad and I'm caring about my white suburban dad life, thinking more about whether you have the same identity as me or whether you have a different one. We are all wanting these same fundamental human things. I do a lot of human rights work, especially in queer and feminist communities, also doing some big projects with newcomer and refugee communities. So you can imagine that type of a bridging context to talk about people about different identities matters a lot in that context, but I think it matters a lot for many CLTs. Next up, you're going to name the problem. And the reason why it says villain is it's just a reminder to make it clear and not passive and abstract. So for example, especially if you can you call out your name that it's the city council that hasn't been acting and needs to do something. You don't literally use the word villain, obviously. That will get you literally nowhere. Mark Carney, the villain. No, no. Um, it's just the framework would say name the villain, and I always find people get really freaked out when I say that. So it's like name the problem, and then that frame of villain reminds you that just like if you're writing a children's storybook or telling a fairy tale or telling any kind of a story, writing a movie plot, there's a villain in any good story, right? So being clear. And the thing with housing, though, is sometimes that you can be naming specific levels of government, and sometimes, of course, we get into it. So there's like systems and the financialization of the market, but be as clear as possible. Your villain can be a system, but if you can call out like an entity, like a certain level of government, do that. So introduce the issue that your messaging and work aims to address, and clearly name it in an active voice, not a passive voice. Next, you're going to name the solution and the vision. So I would say the solution is the CLT instrument or whatever the program's work of your organization may be. And that's the solution, sort of the how. And the vision is like what you want for the future of people having a safe and affordable, really supportive place to live in your community. So the CLT is the solution, sort of the how, and the vision is that nice future we're working towards. Sometimes another CLT pitfall and another just nonprofit sector pitfall would be saying oh, we're going to do this thing. Okay, why, right? Like, what's the vision? What are you actually working towards? What's the impact? That's very important. And make it, if you can, a collective vision for the future. We, our, us, right? You can use a we or an our or an us in a way where you're trying to draw the audience into the collective frame, and they feel like they're part of it, even if they aren't yet. Be inviting and not exclusive. Clearly articulate what we want and how we plan to get there. Then next, end with a call to action. So when applicable, encourage the audience to take a specific action that aligns with your message. Something that I would note is you may start writing, and I would encourage you to start writing key messaging on your organization in general. And sometimes you may write all of this, but then maybe sometimes there's a different call to action. Maybe you're actively in some sort of advocacy process or bond raise process, and therefore you have that call to action one time, but then maybe at a different part of the year or to a different audience, you're advocating for something else. I always like to say as well, some people think, okay, how many audiences do I have? 7. How many different things I have to say? 10. Okay, therefore, now we have 70 different messages and making it like a matrix. Don't do that, because you can't be consistent if you're saying a million different things. So instead of trying to come up with as many different messages as possible for all the different audiences, do the opposite. Try to narrow it down as much as possible. Literally try to think of like, okay, what would the about page of our website say, right? You don't have you're going to have like one about page, or if, someone is speaking to an audience of, say, like the media, it's not like CBC has click here if you're a funder and you're the United Way, or click here if you're a community member in Parkdale. So, of course, messaging often does need to be tailored for different audiences, but don't try to always skip past the commonality and just jump to writing a bunch of different sets of messaging. Start with trying to have as consistent as much as possible, and then only differentiate it when needed. So something that I'll do when a client really has a need to differentiate is so imagine if instead of this was instructions, this was all messaging. Maybe on the third bullet, there could be something like, highlighted in yellow in brackets, being like, and if for government, or and if for this audience, add that. But so that's what I mean by, instead of writing totally different messaging for everyone all the time, only do it when needed. And someone very smart once said in a messaging workshop that I took, imagine the Mona Lisa. So it's famous, everyone knows it, yada, yada, yada. The Mona Lisa has a mythology around it that you're supposed to be able to walk around the room and the eyes are supposed to follow you. Is that true? I don't know. But The idea there is the analogy that if you're talking about affordable housing and if you're sort of saying the same thing, you want to have the same message that just a funder may think of it in one way and a community member may think about it another way. Like people can be in different experiences reading the same information and maybe it hits them in a slightly different way, but it's still the Mona Lisa, which could be different if you're a painter or if you are a art historian, but it's still consistent. The Mona Lisa didn't become to be the Mona Lisa by having 1,000 different Mona Lisas. We wouldn't remember how they looked like. So this is the messaging framework, and we're going to do a bit of an exercise with this. So as a reminder, lead with an emotional connection, introduce the problem in an active voice, present the solution and vision, and include a call to action. Okay, so we are going to build some messaging by talking, just as a bit of an exercise. Let's pick a topic that all of us would be able to do. So let's think of some example. Obviously, we could just do like CLTs, but it would be interesting to pick something that's a little bit more specific than that, but that could relate to everyone here. Does anyone have any suggestions? Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Okay, great idea. I'd love to get some other ideas and we can think about what's going to be easiest as just sort of a quick exercise. Does anyone have any other ideas? Yep. Okay. 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 What about how would you folks feel about if we did something like talking about why the government should fund acquisitions or something? I'm trying to think of something that would apply to all of you. Those are good ideas. And if I were working with your organization one-on-one, I'd say, let's do it. But some of you are from all over the place. So that's just a thought. I see a hand up. Yep. 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 So what that sounds like is a very good emotional connection. That was a really good emotional connection that could then dovetail into, one of those subject matters that we've been talking about. We could talk about exactly what you said, people getting pushed out, and then what's the solution? And maybe it could be an acquisition fund, for example. Um, Does anyone want to name a certain jurisdiction that doesn't have an acquisition fund that we could be pretending to write it as? Someone had been telling me Manitoba doesn't, so that would be an example. But yeah, yeah, Jamie's like Manitoba. Great. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, just to repeat what Jamie said in the mic, I know Jamie from Winnipeg, and Jamie was reiterating what I just said on that Manitoba doesn't have an acquisition fund. So let's use that topic. Not all of you are from Manitoba, however, going through the exercise of making an argument around why the government should give folks like your CLTs money to buy properties is an example of a topic that all of you can learn from. So let's do that. We're going to be pretending to be doing Manitoba, but it could be also for your city or for your province, territory, etc. Because it's a whole very patchy landscape here, right? So great. I am remembered on what our colleague there had just said about people being pushed out. So that was maybe a bit of a hint. That's of one example of something that is a emotional connection. But so what we're going to do here is we're going to say things. Maybe I can pass the mic around actually, and or oh maybe even yeah. Maybe there's a second mic. If yeah, okay, great, cool. Thank you for that AV request on the fly. That's very appreciated for accommodating that. So we're going to say these out loud. You would normally be writing out your messaging, but we're in a workshop and we're going to do things collectively. Another thing to say as well is you'd be writing these down in bullet points. I encourage you to just, when you're doing it, just get started. Just write it out. It's a rough draft. You don't have to be really fearful to put words down to the pages. Just write it out. And then go back and analyze the heck of it. So I actually do a relatively quick draft process of emotional connection, problem and villain, solution and vision, call to action. Like I write it out pretty quickly. It just sort of flows. And the more you do this, the more it flows. I have taught this method to people who before would be like, blank piece of paper, what do I do? And then now I could go and hear that same nonprofit ED on the radio and I'm like, emotional connection, problem, solution, vision. People just start to learn to speak in this way, in a way that flows. You could be doing this to prepare for a media interview, a speech, talking at a staff meeting, preparing some sort of announcement or topic. This is like a multi-channel, like multi-audience, overall messaging framework. So I saw someone with your hand up. So what is, do you have a question or would you like to suggest an emotional connection to kick things off?
Bringing you this mic.
Oh, thank you. How thoughtful. Thanks. Who would like to kick things off with a emotional connection to get us started on why the government should give money for people to buy buildings for good, I'm saying for people, for organizations like yours to buy buildings for affordable housing? What would be an emotional connection? Yeah, and we're gonna give a couple of people ideas of, maybe someone says a sentence and we're like, wow, that's perfect. No one else needs to try, but I may get a couple of you to weigh in. Yes, thanks so much.
I'm just gonna build on the getting kicked out of their home.
Yeah, huge.
Keeping people in their neighborhood, in their community. We have the same thing in Vancouver, Chinatown with the single room occupancy. So yeah, I get it when you say the emotional connection.
Yeah.
That cuts through a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and you know, this makes me think of an analogy that's used a lot. So say if you're 10 years old and you're trying to convince your parents, perhaps my parents, to let us make some sweet treats. You're not going to say, hey, can we turn on the oven to 450 degrees, get out some cocoa powder, whisk it up, sift it, add in some milk, add in some chocolate chips, add in some flour. You just say, Mom and Dad, I want brownies. I had, you know, it would just, my friends are coming over. Like, it would make me the coolest kid on the block. My birthday's next week. You know what I mean, right? Like, but sometimes the brownie of it all, the brownie here is the vision, the brownie here is what we'd all want, is replaced by the technical messaging. So when you just say, the government should really turn on the oven to 450 degrees and take the cocoa powder out of the cupboard and add the milk and add, okay, clearly I don't know a whole brownie recipe off the top of my head, right? But like, the policymakers would be able to understand, oh, okay, this is a brownie recipe. But like, will they be won over? That's what I mean by when I say policymakers and politicians and experts and funders are people too. And if you're talking to someone at CMHC or a particularly housing focused city councilor, an urban planner, whatever, if they're working in this area, then not only are they people too, but they probably actually really care about housing. Like if you're talking to a funder that is funding housing, they care. So it's just like tug on their heartstrings. It goes a long way. Yeah, I want to pass it over. So
Does you want to go here? You go.
Okay, great. So we'll do another emotional connection. It could be the same one and you're just building on it, working on it, or whatever, giving it a go as a sentence, or you could try another idea for an emotional connection, whatever you want.
Yeah, I was just going to say everyone deserves a safe and
Yeah.
stable home.
Yes, yeah, that is an example of a sort of emotional connection. And you know what? That sentence and what our colleague from Vancouver just said, those would be an example of something that could be sort of combined, sort of starting to be combined, into this messaging, right? Because everyone deserves a safe. You could say something like, everyone here in Manitoba deserves to have a safe and stable place to call home, so that they and their families can thrive. And then we could start. Another thing I should say, that when you do this a lot, a common question is like, ooh, is this part the emotional connection? Or is this part the problem? When you write it out and you start analyzing it with your colleagues and you start being like, does this belong here? Does this belong there? And that's what I meant by you just sort of write it out and you like tweak it and you think about it. So, sometimes that sort of like people being pushed out, maybe you put that in the emotional connection, or maybe in some cases, maybe that part gets introduced in the problem. So thanks so much. Yeah. Yes. So that was an example. Sorry, that was someone saying a example. Now I feel like a pop star when I'm in the middle of the room. I can just stand over here for a bit when I run around with the mics. The question was whether it makes sense to name people and give examples. And yeah, sometimes it will. Sometimes you're going to give examples of a person, or of a building or of a neighborhood or something. And sometimes you'll be more talking about, in this case, like at the Manitoba level. We're also going to go over a secondary framework for individual storytelling in a bit. So that also could fit well in my other framework. Jamie.
So from a Manitoba perspective,
Thank you, Jamie.
I would really like to think about how to link this to truth and reconciliation. And because the focus of our organization is housing for Indigenous women and their families.
Yeah.
And so thinking about that in the, that reconciliation part of it is the rematriation of this neighborhood for Indigenous women to thrive somewhere in there. And I know rematriation, I have to explain that. I just say it's like the patriarchy, but for women, and in a good way,
I love that line, the patriarchy, but for women, and in a good way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jamie and I have clearly met each other already, and Jamie's at an organization called Clan Mothers. You should all look it up. It's very cool, and they're helping Indigenous women heal on the land, and it's very amazing. So Jamie brings up a very good point on how in Winnipeg, the portion of folks who are experiencing homelessness who are Indigenous is enormously elevated. So that's a good point, and we have picked Manitoba. So to talk more about that, when you were writing this messaging, that would be something to name, like 100% in Manitoba. You could be talking only about Indigenous housing to the province. You also could be talking about housing and homelessness in general in Manitoba, and like 100%. That's like something to name. That's something that organizations name a lot. That's something to sort of push with that audience 100%. So to bring this all together on how everyone deserves to have a safe and stable place to call home so that they and their families are able to thrive. But unfortunately, to bridge to the problem, in our communities, such as, you could name some neighborhoods in Winnipeg, such as, the North End, you could name neighborhoods that are experiencing gentrification. Some people in our communities are being pushed out due to gentrification, due to rents becoming more unaffordable, and this just isn't acceptable. And further, in Manitoba, the rate of Indigenous communities who are experiencing homelessness is much higher. I honestly don't have the stat on my top of my head, unfortunately, but it would be.
I think we're easily 70% of our homelessness population is Indigenous.
Yes.
Homeless population is Indigenous.
Yeah.
The other piece is that there's huge development happening downtown that's pushing a traditional neighborhood out of the space that they've occupied A downtown mall that became a big white elephant
Yeah.
is now being repurposed into a bougie medical clinic.
Yeah. You bet.
And a housing tower, and it's actively right now pushing folks out of that. So there is there's this part here about reclaiming community space, perhaps, and about enabling all citizens in all neighborhoods in Winnipeg to have access to a community center.
Yeah, you bet. And what Jamie just said sort of bridged from the problem, which we were naming on people being pushed out of their communities. Naming downtown is a really good example in the Winnipeg context. And also we named the significantly higher rate of Indigenous homelessness. And then Jamie just bridged to the sort of starting to go into the solution on, reclaiming, community space. But then what would bridge into continuing the solution and starting to name about why we should fund, why the provincial government should fund acquisitions?
Because I'm not Mark Chippen.
Rich guy. Yeah. Oh, I just, just in case anyone needs to,
Okay.
help you.
Well, one thing we say in Hamilton a lot, because it's like the city, like part of the city is like extremely bougie and conservative, and part of the city is not that. And so one thing that we say that we like, I don't know, it seems to resonate well with everybody is that the idea that like the most affordable housing is the housing that's already built.
Yes. Yeah.
So like, hey, conservative people who don't want to spend a lot of money, don't you want to solve this problem and also in a fiscally responsible way?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example of it, because we say build, 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 and then it's like, how? Like, that takes a lot of money. That takes a lot of time. That's like really difficult. It's hard to get the government to do things. It's hard to get the government to build housing. So that would be an example of like a plain language way to talk about funding acquisitions. And in terms of saying that the most affordable housing, or the most affordable way to have, lower cost housing is taking housing that already exists rather than having to build new housing. So rather than, that would be an example of practicing what we preach on starting with plain language rather than just jumping to like talking about an acquisition fund. You said that very well, right? And remember how I said, and sometimes you want to say the clear first and then name the technical. So want to repeat what you just said, if you don't mind?
The most affordable housing is the housing that is already built.
No. Yeah.
With, you can vary it. I think sometimes we say like the most affordable. Yeah, no, that's it. The most affordable housing is the housing that's already built. Yeah, there you go.
You bet, you bet. And you could say, but in order to keep this housing affordable rather than it being rent-evicted and being lost to the private market, being lost when developers decide to get rid of it, the province should help fund social organizations and nonprofits to be able to buy the housing. Another thing I will mention is that remember when I said when you do this, it's just like first draft, just get it out there. And then you sit down and you look at every single bullet and you ask yourself questions like, was that the best emotional connection, or is there another one? Was the sentence written clearly, or could we tighten it up? Does this part fit better in the problem or the emotional connection or in the solution, whatever, right? That's when you go and you start, to rework this. For the call to action, you just be saying like the provincial government should support an acquisition fund in Manitoba to help nonprofit organizations be able to buy new stock in housing and keep it affordable, so that our communities can have affordable housing when they need it. So say we had all this written down. I would be saying things like, is this sentence as tight as possible? Is this other sentence clear? If we know we're going to be talking to a certain audience, asking like, would they understand a certain bullet? But another thing you look at as well is like, did we name the right problem? And another thing to keep in mind as well is the problem So in this context, I would say, like, is the problem there's not enough affordable housing? Or you could say, is the problem that CLTs and nonprofits face way too many barriers and don't have enough money when they are trying to buy affordable housing? And sometimes you can even have sort of like a bit of a two-part problem by saying something like, amidst an escalating housing crisis, nonprofits face tremendous barriers and often don't have the cash needed to be able to buy affordable housing and preserve it. So see how I like made that like a clear, like amidst the housing crisis, comma, nonprofits are facing barriers when trying to buy this. It's like you're naming both problems. And if you were to frame it that way, technically the problem that you're most emphasizing would be there being barriers to y'all getting all of the buildings that you want. But you are still hinting at the housing crisis again, which you would have said it at the beginning and you're sort of saying it again at the end. So of course, this was just an exercise. You would be looking at all of these bullets, seeing if anything could be tighter, clearer, more persuasive, and being like, did I get the right problem, the right solution, etc. It's one of those times where you write it and you put it aside and you come back and you work on it a lot and you show it to your colleagues and maybe you show it to someone who doesn't know anything about CLTs and you see if they understand. So now we're going to talk about a second messaging framework. The first one was the sort of default messaging framework for organizations that I teach, whether they're small and grassroots or like really large and established. That was the default organizational messaging framework. Now, this is a storytelling-based framework to use when you are helping to tell someone's story as an individual. So maybe you are saying your story about housing, why you want to preserve affordable housing in Truro, where you live, or in West Broadway, where you live, right? You could be talking about what you've experienced, or you could be working with someone who has experienced something and wants to tell their story. So you could be telling your own story or helping someone tell their story. So this is particularly helpful for, it could be a quote on your website, a quote on social media. Someone could be speaking to the Toronto Star. Someone could be giving a speech at a gala, right? There are many contexts where using an individual story is very powerful. But I find that a lot of advice to nonprofits on comms is like, do storytelling. Okay, how? Like, it's like, what do you do? What do you say? How do you make it strategic? And in this case, it's to tell a story to help motivate people to care about the issue and ultimately tie them back to knowing where you want them to take action. So you may be wondering why there's a picture of the mayor of Toronto, Olivia Chow, and some old guy with his hand up. That man is named Marshall Gans, and in the 60s and 70s in the United States, he was a labor organizer, particularly with migrant farm workers. And you can just imagine the immense issues in working conditions and pay that migrant farm workers continue to face now in the US and Canada, but even imagine in the 60s and 70s, that would have been brutal. So he was trying to convince them to help start a union, help their colleagues unionize. And what he noticed, particularly as someone who didn't share that same background, he found that getting one person to tell their story to another person who was also a worker, like one of their colleagues working on the farm, really was like the most motivating thing. And he developed this framework to help support people in telling their story in a way that is strategic and helps motivate people to action. But what I like is it's like 3 bullets. It's super simple. You can just remember this, and it's not complicated. You're not telling someone who has experienced something to be like, here's this 17-point framework in this whole PDF to fill out. Instead, it's a 3-bullet format of, I'll go over this in more detail in a second, but story of self, story of us, story of now. Olivia Chow is on the screen because she first ran for mayor of Toronto in 2014. She then lost. And she did what any politician does when they lose. they go around and they ask smart people and their friends, like, oh no, what do I do now? And she happened to go talk to Marshall Gans, who was like, well, I have this great storytelling and organizing framework and approach that you're going to love. She was so inspired by this framework that she literally founded an institute at Toronto Metropolitan University, the university formerly known as Ryerson, that teaches this. It's called the Institute for Change Leaders. Honestly, it would be a really great thing to think about more CLT movement folks to take some of their trainings. They're very neat, and they sometimes do themed cohorts. And they teach this and also more things sort of linked to this approach in great detail. So she spent like 7 years running an institute that talked about using storytelling for social change. And I took a couple of her trainings, and she trained people for many years. So you can imagine when you spend 7 years telling people how to do storytelling, you get really good at telling your own story. So then when Olivia ran again for mayor of Toronto just a few years ago, her story and how strategically it was used to help people care about causes and connect to voters amidst a very crowded mayoral field where she just kind of really dominated, it was amazing. So I like to tell this story about Olivia because at the time I was living in Ottawa. I didn't live in Toronto. I've never lived in Toronto. I didn't help Olivia's team. I was just familiar with this framework and knew that she ran an institute that really taught it. And I would be listening to her and I could just be like, 1, 2, 3, like knowing how systematically she was following this, but in a way that felt fluid and connecting, not robotic. So what is this framework? You start with your story of self. So let's just give an example that's housing related from Olivia's mayoral campaign. She would say things like that her mother was a domestic worker and her father was not working when she was growing up in Toronto. But back then, their family was able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment in downtown Toronto on her mother's salary, and that allowed her family to have stability and support and housing when they really needed it, when her dad couldn't work, and when Olivia was growing up, going to school, they were able to have that. Then they bridged to the story of us. So you go from talking about yourself to your community and say, she'd always use the line, but Toronto just isn't, but we all know that Toronto just isn't affordable anymore. And all of us, either ourselves or with the loved ones around us, know the struggle of trying to find affordable housing in Toronto. You can maybe you want an apartment, but you can only get a room somewhere very far away. It's just not very affordable now. She'll mention that if the same thing was happening today of someone who was a family of 3 on a domestic worker salary, that it would just be impossible. But then again, you relate it to the us by saying, hundreds of, I'm like struggling with numbers in Toronto. I'm like millions of us, millions of us are struggling to afford this. Then you bridge to the story of now. So now you would say, why now more than ever? We need to act. And in this mayoral election, we have a historic opportunity to vote for a mayor who will take such and such and such policy actions to be able to make housing more affordable for people in Toronto, like including your family. Sorry, I don't remember her housing policies at the time off the top of my head, but that's an example. And it can be called Gans theory. It can be called public narrative. Sometimes I'm trying to remind people of this framework. I'll say like, hey, it's that story of self, story of us, story of now thing. So this is a really important framework, but you really are going to be only using it with people who are comfortable telling their story, who are not pressured, who are supported in being able to make that choice in a non-exploitative way. And the reason why our stories help is because each of our stories contribute to a collective voice demanding change. So you may think of yourself as an individual, but it helps people relate to it. So as some storytelling guidelines, I was just mentioning on this, always uphold ethical storytelling principles. And you could have like an entire presentation just on that, right? So there's lots of really good guidelines on online. Be wary of power imbalances, make sure someone's comfortable telling their story, and avoid exploitative stories. So a difference between an exploitative story and a non-exploitative story is maybe while someone is in crisis, it doesn't make any sense to tell their story, but maybe you can find someone who's gone through a challenging time and is wanting to support your organization and talk about it after the fact. So for the second bit of this presentation, and then we're going to jump to questions in one moment, it's messaging infrastructure. So we've talked about how to write messaging, but it's like, where do you put it and how do you use it in your organization? So I like to call that like infrastructure, messaging infrastructure. So I would encourage you all to write message guides, and I am giving you a template for this that talks about where you would put the boilerplate info about your land trust, some tone guidelines in terms of what are the attributes that best describe how your organization's voice sounds. Is it neighborly? Is it authoritative, right? That you'd write that down. And it also gives sections to say you need to write about messaging on something specific. You may need to write messaging just on a bond campaign, just on a certain new building you got, just on a certain bill before city council, et cetera. So you write the overall messaging in addition to the specific, and the template will help you with that. So additionally, assign someone who is responsible for this. Don't have like a billion different people editing a document. It will be chaos. So have one person who's allowed to edit it, and the rest of your team can chip in with giving feedback and say, oh, I have an idea how to make this better. Another thing is when you make it, make sure that you finish it and it's final, but then 6 months down the road, someone may have an idea to update it. So it becomes a bit of a living document, although in a pretty formal way. So say if you have a new project or a new initiative or a new campaign, you may need to update your messaging to make sure that's included. Additionally, you could have a big shift, like a new strategic plan and a new way of doing things. Go and review your messaging and make sure it's up to date. Or maybe you just come up with a better way to say something. Another way that messaging gets developed is you could be in conversation and someone could say something and you're like, ooh, that really resonated. That was really great. Like, let's write that down. So that's just like improved phrasing. And additionally, make sure to tell everybody that the message guide exists, put it in onboarding packages for new team members, make sure it's used. This is not a document that's gate kept. This is a document that while everyone should not be editing it, I would believe someone could be in your organization and just in a finance role, and you think that they're not in comms. Well, they talk about your CLT to their friends, to partners. So whatever their role is, you should make sure that they can get it. Additionally, today's presentation was on messaging, not on comms, but other things to have as comms infrastructure include a message guide, a communication strategy, a visual brand guide, and some key templates, right? So I'm not saying that a message guide is all you need, just what we happen to be talking about today. Bringing it all together will help you have messaging that moves people from awareness to action with clear values-led communication that's essential, including in a difficult time. And community land trusts have a very compelling story. So tell it often and tell it well. So at the end, I will allow this QR code to be up to get that worksheet. And there is some further reading for anyone who wants to read more about this subject, but if you don't worry about it because I summarized it. So does anyone have any questions? Yeah. No, go ahead. There's a mic right in front of you.
This isn't so much a question as just like an idea for everybody. Because you were talking about like ethics and storytelling and stuff.
Yep.
And like I'm an academic and I do qualitative research, so I was just thinking like, if you're unsure, maybe a good resource would be like your local university, because every university has a research ethics board.
Yep.
And so anyone who does research like I do, like interviewing people and stuff, like we have to go through really rigorous ethical guidelines and sort of jump through a lot of hoops to make sure that the research we do is ethical. So if you're ever like at a loss, there's the university would probably be like a really good resource. Or if you have a friendly local PhD that you can ask, like
Yep.
Yeah, that's just a thought.
So that's a great idea on there being research guidelines. There's also a wealth of storytelling specific ethical storytelling guidelines online. So I would just say search ethical storytelling and guidelines and read them. There's really great resources. Again, that's the type of thing I could have talked about just for an entire hour today. So great point on research ethics, and there's great resources on ethical storytelling online with specific definitions and checklists. So it's not a nebulous thing. There's specific steps to follow. Yes.
Thank you so much. This was fantastic. It's interesting, and I'm glad that I chose this session. Storytelling.
Yeah.
It's as I think definitely coming from Black culture, storytelling has been our way to have resolve about a lot of issues. And so being in the housing space, when I think about storytelling in the space that I'm at, which is in Minnesota in the US, boo. But with that being said, they it really comes back down to data. And it drives me absolutely mad. And definitely when it's a Black and brown story, the storytelling becomes minimized. And it's a story of my life and every other person's life who's Black and brown. For starters, though we're extremely inclusive in our work, I always say, I start out with saying a story about this young lady who has a fixed income, this, that, the other, has a disability, on disability, had 2 children on disability, her rent payment, 1 bedroom, 2 daughters, all disability income, $1,600 a month in rent, plus utilities. She came to the land trust. She bought her first home through us. We gave her up to $200,000 in subsidy. Her mortgage payment all in is $596 a month. We sent, yeah.
Yeah.
Her children now have a home, their own bedroom, and a backyard to play in. We sent over 1,000 people through our programming last year. We've educated over 1,000. They did home stretch. They got certified. They did all the things. They got pre-approved. They did all that. What wonderful storytelling. We have a substantial pipeline in waiting, and I need to advocate for funding. They wasn't interested in a story. What a, excuse my French, I'm gonna be real clear here. What a bunch of bullshit.
Yeah.
So the storytelling piece, I appreciate it. And the question is, outside of the storytelling, how much does the data?
Great question. Yeah. No, so that's a great question. And there's a great saying on this. I did not come up with a saying, and I can't remember who did. I'm sorry about that, but it's no data without narrative and no dare to. Sorry, let me try that one more time. No data without narrative and no narrative without data. So that's what that saying thinks. And it's to use data, but do not use data alone, and to wrap storytelling and messaging and framing around the data. So when it says no data without narrative, it means that your data should be accompanied by good messaging and framing. And then when it says no narrative without data, the other way around, it means that you should be using data to strengthen your messaging. So in terms of when you're naming the problem, naming so specific stats for that, or naming the solution in terms of naming the impact of CLTs, you may be able to bring up stats on that as well. Great question. Does anyone have any other questions? Yep.
Yeah, in my case, I come back to this seniors housing issue that we're trying to resolve.
Yeah.
And my main messaging is to actual co-op members, existing co-op members that are going to ask me, why should I have a land trust? We've been organizing co-ops for 40, 50 years. What's the difference? What's my advantage?
Yeah. Was that a question? Right. Well, you tell me, what's the solution? No. But I have a question though. Like, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to
Well,
use
I'm
the
trying
land
to
trust?
see what's the difference. What's my advantage to be a CLT versus a housing co-op? Yeah,
I mean,
that exists for 30 years already.
Yeah,
I imagine
it's about leverage, but let's get your colleague to answer this.
So the CLTs will allow you to do what you've done really well for generations, to continue that and to make sure that the housing is protected, and that the communities continue to thrive and do what they've done really well for the last 30 to 50 years.
But that's not enough for my community.
Right.
I need more.
Well, why are you organizing this specific community? Like, why are you going to those specific so that's it's this. I would say that it's a messaging thing to deal with, but also sometimes things are bigger than messaging. Like Power Map, who supports CLTs in your area, who supports seniors housing, in your area, and so that's something to think about. It's how to win those co-ops over, but are you also talking to the right people at the right, talking to the right people, right? So, is there anybody there who's supportive?
No,
So why are you trying to do it?
because I'm thinking maybe it's an interesting option to do,
Yep.
but I have no idea. Am I on the right track? Should I even bother?
Totally.
You need a meeting with her.
Yeah. Sounds like you can give each other some advice. Because I definitely like using this and refining a story on the power of land trusts and something on protecting it forever. I think that's a really important message. So I would center that protecting it forever. And sometimes you can also say to try to get even more affordable housing for seniors like yourself. So that strikes me on protecting it forever and on also trying to have more of it. So that strikes me as the emotional resonance. But I think some of your colleagues can talk about this a little bit more with you. And I'll come to you next.
So we're from New York City, where there's an incredibly rich and long co-op housing history. But now I'm pretty sure it's something like 3/4 of the housing co-ops in New York City are in distress because, the co-ops, voted not to increase maintenance fees, hard to just keep up with the operations of buildings. Obviously insurance is costly right now. So like they're seriously deteriorating. Another thing is that, co-op boards will vote to get rid of the limited equity aspect of the co-op. So, essentially go market rate.
Yeah.
And so by having a community land trust, you can, there's this entity that's thinking about the broader community and ensuring that it doesn't privatize essentially. But also, to the first point, I think having the community land trust own the land can help support the co-op so that it doesn't fall into distress. And that's really how we're thinking about it.
Great answer. And I loved hearing more about your land trust in New York yesterday. It was great. Would you like to? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think that question is one many of us have grappled with, especially when we didn't have so much information about community land trust. But one of the things I see, having worked with co-ops like 50 years ago, was that they're very much more prescriptive in terms of definitions. For example, definitions of affordability. And we, in the workshop yesterday, we raised that co-ops really were not reaching the lower income people and also marginalized people. Whereas community land trust, because the community is so active, they can totally change the definition of affordability. So they can lower themselves. They don't have to have anybody tell them. They can decide what affordability means, and also they have more leverage from the community in terms of who will benefit with that co-ops aren't doing. For example, co-ops have not been reaching those same marginalized, racialized community that we're looking at community land trusts being able to do. And that's a big, huge difference.
Thank you. And also thank you for your amazing, just contributions. I've followed your work and your land trust a bit, Dr. Lynn, so thanks so much. And just to wrap us up, I am just going to take to one last little resource slide, with the QR code. I just wanted to mention briefly, I know this is housing conference, but I did just want to mention if any of you are also either doing cross movement work or particularly doing work related to supporting immigrants and newcomers, I just wanted to also flag that the Canadian Council for Refugees is using some of the approaches that we've been talking about today to run a big national campaign trying to improve public opinion on immigrants and refugees, because as we know, Canadian public opinion on that has been backsliding. So not exactly what we've been talking about, but I just wanted to flag that in our resource slide, you'll be able to use this QR code. There is a messaging guide. There is a link to the slides, and the slides mention all of the further reading and resources and names of people and organizations. And if you do happen to be interested, there's a link related to that campaign, just if you may have anyone to let you know about that. So know about that. So thanks so much to everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your conference. It's been a pleasure being here.